I see the Peter. You know I got the Jones for my own Rashida. Can you put me on with the Nagarita? She stay on my dome, she gon' pull on me, pull like weed inside me. She my queen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Civic Queen. Today, we'll be going over the redistricting process and also giving a few tips about how to share public testimony. All right, I'm going to first get started by sharing my screen. All right, so this training was created by Move Texas, the Texas Civil Rights Project, are also known as TCRP, and Texas Rising. So today we're going to cover the history of redistricting. We're going to go over who's currently in charge, and then also share how you can engage and what you can do to kind of like change the trajectory of what's been happening here. So what is redistricting? Redistricting is the process by which an area is divided or organized into new districts, usually as far as like the political district, right? We are a representative democracy. And so in order to be accurately represented, a decennial census is taken and new districts are drawn to reflect the past decade's population changes. The districts that need to be drawn are the congressional districts, state senate, state house, state board of education, and a few other districts, including like the water board. So now we're going to cover a familiar term called gerrymandering. This often is discussed when we talk about the power of the vote and also like the process of redrawing the lines. And so I think it's important to kind of give some vocabulary and background information about how this process affects us. So gerrymandering is the manipulation of district lines so that it favors one outcome, a party, or a class, right? The effects include suppressing the will of the people, which in turn usually silences voices of Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color. There are more polarized politics. So you have districts that are almost completely Democratic or completely Republican when you engage in this type of tactic. And then it also limits who can run for office in that area because you do have these polarized districts. So how does this process work, right? There are 5 key steps to the redistricting process. The first being when the census sends out its workers and conducts the survey, right? So you have folks who may be knocking on your door and having you fill out the survey right then. And then this year we also had, or in 2020, we also had the opportunity to complete the survey online, which led to, I believe, higher numbers of completion, which gives us a better idea of who is where. Once the census data is processed, it is then released to the Congress for apportionment. Apportionment is when Congress decides whether or not the number of representatives for a certain area is still feasible based on the changes in population. So this is where you may sometimes hear folks saying, oh, Texas may gain or lose a couple House seats based on the census data. This is known as the process of apportionment, making sure that we have full representation for the amount of folks that are living in our area. After the apportionment process, the full census data is released to the states for redistricting, right? And this normally happens around the beginning of April of the following year. So this is when the states have a chance to kind of create new maps that they think would address the population changes that were revealed through the census. right? And so this is where you have state legislators meeting, holding hearings, and drawing new maps that are presented on the House and the Senate floor for a vote and adoption, right? So depending on the party and the area, these maps can look drastically different, which is why the maps are voted on before they're adopted. And lastly, once the adoption process has been completed and everyone on both the House of Representatives and the Senate floor have agreed upon one map, the maps then take into effect and then the new district lines are implemented, right? And again, this affects how you vote, right? It affects the power of your vote. You may be on the border of a district, and after the new maps are adopted, you may be in a completely different district. Who is in charge of this process? So the state legislature has two committees in charge of the redistricting process. One is the House Redistricting Committee, which Phil King is currently the chair of. And then we have the Senate Special Committee on Redistricting, and Joan Huffman is the current chair. Both are Republicans, and that is largely due to just the number of Republicans in those, in both the House and the Senate at the moment. On the left, we see the list of representatives that are currently on the House Redistricting Committee. So at first glance, I do see a few folks from from Dallas County. So Toni Rose is the vice chair of this committee, and she is the representative from District 110. And Rafael Anchia is the representative from District 103. On the right, we have a list of all of the senators that are included in the Senate Special Committee on Redistricting. And at first glance, I also acknowledge Roy West, who is the senator for our area as well. These are the folks who will be kind of helping to push this process along and making sure that we adopt maps that are fair and just. If you look at the top portion here, this is a very large district, right? And you have folks here right at the tip of Texas that are also coupled with folks in the DFW region, which is hours away. And this is kind of highlighting what gerrymandering can do. So this makes it so that one representative is forced to address the concerns of folks that may live in rural areas up here and all throughout this region. And then you get into the more urban areas who have different needs and concerns, right? And that's what we mean by silencing the voice of certain populations. When you're kind of pushed into these larger districts and sectioned off in ways that are unrealistic for the area that you live in and the needs of that area. If you look over here closer to the DFW region, we have four major counties: Collin, Tarrant, Denton, and Dallas County. And you see that there are a lot of different districts here, right? Instead of making it large, one large area voting population, they've kind of broken it up to kind of minimize the effect of an individual vote, so that you're not necessarily voting with folks that live around you in a large block, as you see in other parts of the state. And you see the same thing when looking at this map, which is a map of the state Senate districts. And so you see the same thing. You see these large blocks for certain districts. And then when you get to the metropolitan areas, you see that it's kind of rationed off into smaller sections to minimize the vote of the power of the vote in those regions. Like I said before, kind of combining rural areas with more urban areas is how they kind of leverage the voice of areas that have fewer population by kind of picking off some of those urban outskirts. And here's the state house districts. So these districts look a little bit better, right? There aren't these huge, these large distances between the one end of a district to the next, right? We do have smaller districts, largely because there are more house districts than there are Senate districts and congressional districts. There are more seats in these positions, and so there's just an opportunity there's just not as great of an opportunity to pack as many folks into one district. But if you do see down here, this is a very large district, and these folks have very different needs. They are on the border, but they're also coupled with folks that are more inland and may not have some of the same concerns. Again, with this area here, this is a very large House district that can potentially be broken up into a smaller area so that the population is more representative of one kind of area. Adopting a fair map this year will be held to different regulations due to the results of the Shelby versus Holder court case that was held in 2013. This was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court regarding the constitutionality of two provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Section 5, which requires certain states and local governments to obtain federal pre-clearance before implementing any changes to their voting laws or practices, and Section 4B, which contains the coverage formula that determines which jurisdictions are subjected to pre-clearance based on their histories of discrimination in voting. In June of 2013, the court ruled by a 5-4 vote that Section 4B is unconstitutional because the coverage formula is based on data over 40 years old, making it no longer responsive to current needs and therefore an impermissible burden on the constitutional principles of federalism and equal sovereignty of the states. The court did not strike down Section 5, but without Section 4B, no jurisdiction will be subject to Section 5 preclearance unless Congress enacts a new coverage formula. So some believe that this ruling makes it easier for state officials to make it harder for ethnic minority voters to vote. 2021 will be the first time that Texas has adopted a redistricting map without federal oversight since 1965. So we are waiting patiently to see if our legislators will decide to move forward with equity and justice at the forefront of their decision-making process, ensuring that minorities, especially those in impoverished areas, have access to the civic process. So here is where you come in, right? So now we're going to go over how to connect your personal narrative to the issue of redistricting, right? So in the political context, testimony is the official comment submitted to the Texas legislator. Testimony goes on to the official legislative record and is subject to disclosure under the Public Information Act. Testimony is powerful because it lets legislators know the real-life impacts and concerns of Texans. For example, when redistricting begins, the Texas legislator receives data and numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau. Testimony helps to contextualize this data and bring a human aspect to consideration when drawing the maps. Here is a breakdown of how to curate an effective testimony. So every testimony is unique. It's a personal story, but there are ways of making your testimony more impactful and more memorable. You should be sure to include a few things. Your name and address helps to identify that you are a Texan with a lived experience in a specific region. It is important to express explicit demands when giving public testimony. For example, you could share things like the fact that you are in support of an open and fair process that has a racially equitable end result. We can also highlight things like engaging in nonpartisan map making, and also the importance of hosting hearings after the census data has been released. It's also great to share personal anecdotes. Every representative would love to hear solutions that you think could work for making sure that this process is equitable, right? It's also great to accurately describe your community. Share things about your culture, the age range of folks that you live around, and some of the businesses and opportunities that are available to folks in your region. If your district is gerrymandered, describe how the current lines cut up your community and silence the voice of your neighbors. Here is a list of dates and times where you can give public testimony. For our region, the hearing was held on February 4th, but we are all planning to engage on Saturday, February 27th at 9 a.m. for the statewide hearing that will be held. You can click this link, which will be provided below, so that you can sign up. You do have to pre-register to give public testimony. We will also be engaging on a tweet storm on this day, which is where we will record our testimonies and be sending them to our state reps. So be sure to tune in for that week's episode so that you know exactly how and when we're going to engage on the 27th. Now I want to share an example of a young Texan who shared their testimony in a hearing. Oh, you get on my nerves. Stop doing that.
State your name and your I'm Joshua Theron, and I'm representing myself and my siblings. My name is Joshua Theron. I just graduated from high school. My brother, sister, and I grew up right here in a gerrymandered district in Austin, Texas. District 10 to be exact. Representative Howard is actually my representative, so thank you for being here. As we all know, District 10 is a little bit of Austin, a really large swath of the countryside, and a little bit of Houston, a full 3.5-hour drive away. And this is a very familiar feeling for a lot of people living in Austin, whether you're living in District 35, where you're voting with people from Houston, or District 25, and voting with people all the way in Dallas. And all in all, I started talking with my friends about it, and Austin is cracked into 6 separate congressional districts, one city with a little over 1 million people. How does that happen? And what was also really interesting is my friends didn't realize this. And my friends and I talk about politics often, but we never really discussed gerrymandering. And I suspect this is very similar throughout the US, which is one of the reasons I'm actually very thankful for you for holding this hearing, just to get more people to discuss it. But for instance, everybody is talking about Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, or was or has been talking about it. But shouldn't more people also be talking about gerrymandering? And shouldn't more people also be talking about how there were some politicians in 2011 who interfered in election after election after election by purposely drawing unfair maps? So my brother, sister, and I wondered, how do we get more people to talk about gerrymandering while also showing just how crazy it is in general? So we actually decided to invent a board game about it. This is a board game. Representative Turner has actually already received one, as well as Representative Howard. Inside each and every single box of this board game, we are including a gerrymandering is not a game proclamation. You know, sure here. That basically says gerrymandering is not a game. And thanks to our Kickstarter supporters, we have already sent 82 copies of this game to the Supreme Court. And we plan on sending 100. We plan on sending 171 of these copies to state legislators and governors across the country who are instrumental in redistricting. Each and every single legislator who's on this committee will be receiving a game before 2021. And now you may be asking, why am I talking about a board game? But the point is this. When each and every single one of you receive this game, we want you to remember one thing. Gerrymandering is not a game. It affects real people in real districts all across Texas and the country. It's exactly 3 minutes, don't worry. So I'm begging during this redistricting cycle to draw maps fairly. Don't draw them like you're trying to win a board game. Draw them to serve the people you were elected to serve. This game, Mapmaker the Gerrymandering, this is a board game. What will be happening in this legislative house during the redistricting cycle, that's real. I want you all to remember that. Representative Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being here. How many would have thought that gerrymandering would have gotten young people excited about voting? It's really kind of amazing here, but I appreciate very much what you're doing, regardless of the politics here and what anybody else thinks about how this should or shouldn't be done. It's absolutely awesome that young people found a way to get excited about redistricting. It's one of the things that is most important about what happens here, and to have y'all be involved like this is really incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. I hope that you learned something and that you feel confident about how and when to engage during the redistricting hearings. I appreciate all of your attention, your time and attention, and I look forward to speaking with you all next week.